We are delighted to have Bianca Rodriguez-Cardona speaking with us today, speaking about carbon and nitrogen dynamics in Arctic and boreal aquatic ecosystems. My name is Rebecca Free, and I am a PhD student in the CAWS lab supervised by David Olafelt at the University of Alberta. And I will be moderating this event along with my lab mate, Lauren Thompson. For housekeeping, we ask that everyone keep their mics muted for the duration of the meeting. And if it becomes unmuted, then we will mute you. At the end of the meeting, we ask that you submit your questions via chat, and Lauren and I will moderate the questions to direct the discussion. In our last event, it worked best when we read the questions in the order that they came, and then usually the questioner and the presenter could engage in the discussion. But we ask that you submit your question via chat first so that we can keep things orderly and fair. You can go to the next slide, Bianca. I also want to remind you that this is seminar 2 of 3, and in a few weeks' time, we will also hear from Scott Davidson from the University of Waterloo on the impact of linear disturbances across peatlands in northern Alberta. And so if that tickles your fancy, then go to our website, caws.ualberta.ca for registration info. And then next slide. And so with no further ado, I'd like to take a minute to introduce our speaker. Bianca got a BS in environmental science from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus, where she researched biodegradability of DOC, dissolved organic carbon, from an urban watershed in San Juan to the more pristine systems of the Luquillo Mountains. From there, she completed a master's in soil and water resource management at the University of New Hampshire, researching the relationship between carbon and nitrogen in suburban streams of New Hampshire. She stayed on in the same lab group to do a PhD, where she delved deeper into carbon and nitrogen coupling in tropical and Arctic streams. As part of that, she worked in the Central Siberian Plateau in Russia to understand the effects of permafrost thaw and fire on stream chemistry. Through this work, she joined the Polaris Project and visited the Yukon Delta in Alaska. And as a graduate student, she studied the effects of fire on tundra streams and later joined Polaris as a mentor/senior scientist. The other part of her PhD worked in the Luquillo Mountains in Puerto Rico to better understand the role of dissolved organic matter in nitrogen cycling in tropical montane streams. And I told Bianca earlier, with all the places that she's worked in, that's amazing that she had time to write anything up. It's incredible. Working in Luquillo led her to become part of the Critical Zone Observatory, CZO, in which she worked in the French CZO of Guadeloupe to further explore carbon and nitrogen coupling in tropical sites. That turned into a 4-month stint in Paris at the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris, pardon my French, through the Chateaubriand Fellowship. And during that time, she also worked on the geochemistry of rare earth elements, such as boron, and compared streams within these 2 CZOs, Luquillo and Guadeloupe. However, she quickly determined that although boron and geochemistry are interesting, she much prefers carbon and nitrogen and in the much higher latitudes. She is now a postdoc at the University de Quebec in Montreal in the Carbon Biogeochemistry in Boreal Aquatic Systems, or CARBOS group. She is working to better understand how dams influence carbon and nutrient biogeochemistry in La Romaine River in northern Quebec. Thanks again, Bianca, and the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Becca, for that great introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this seminar series. I'm really excited to be able to be amongst more of my polar colleagues, and really excited to talk about these data with you. Boreal forests make up a large part of the terrestrial portion of the northern Arctic, the northern pole in the Arctic, and these forests are really rich in organic matter, which translate to streams and aquatic ecosystems that are really rich in dissolved organic matter, or DOM. But these forests up in the these boreal forests are really sensitive to changes in temperature and in their environment. And we've been seeing over the past, We've been seeing over the past years how warming temperatures have been increasing, and this is an example over this past summer, where in eastern Siberia, some of the highest temperatures recorded were seen, with temperatures above 9 degrees above the normal temperatures. And this is not just a trend in eastern Siberia, but it's in eastern Russia. It's a trend that's been seen in all of the Arctic with warming temperatures, and even the Arctic Ocean ice cover is not fully freezing. And so these warming temperatures are leading to increasing permafrost thaw. And with this permafrost thaw, these large abrupt landscape changes are occurring that are changing how water and nutrients move through the landscape. And this is somewhat of a drastic example of permafrost thaw in Russia, but it's just to show the magnitude that these changes in permafrost thaw can have on the landscape. And along with permafrost thaw, these warming temperatures in the Arctic are leading to fires. And in many boreal forests, fires are not necessarily new. In large forests, like in the Central Siberian Plateau, fires are needed in order for the forest to propagate its seeds. So the fires burn off the moss and open up the organic layer so that the seeds can fall into the soil. But the issue that's happening is that these fires that used to happen on a normal scale of 80 to every 100 years are now becoming a yearly event where there are fires happening almost every single summer. And these fires are leading to really large and abrupt landscape changes. Here are a few images of the effects of fire in the forests of the Central Siberian Plateau. You can see how the organic layer of the moss, the soils have been burned off, the soils are changed around, deeper soil coming up, and the structure and integrity of the soil has changed, along with burning a lot of the vegetation on the top of the soil, like the moss and lots of the large needles. And so these large landscape changes can lead to changes in the aquatic systems, because we know that the terrestrial part and the aquatic systems are tightly linked. In this schematic from Aaron Chotkis and others in 2015, they show really nicely how organic carbon moves from the terrestrial side into the aquatic system and it's being processed. But we know that along with these green arrows showing the terrestrial organic carbon input, there's also nitrogen, phosphorus, and other micronutrients and solutes that come in with that water. And with these large, abrupt landscape changes, they're leading to changes in what's coming into the streams and rivers. And in this very classic study from 1975, Heinz mentioned that the valley rules the stream. So the changes in the landscape will be translated to changes in aquatic ecosystems. And so with that, we were trying to answer this question of how do fires influence stream chemistry and what is the resiliency of these watersheds after wildfires. We had the opportunity to work in the Central Siberian Plateau, and this is outlined in blue in the map of Russia. So it's in the center of Russia, in between Moscow and Chersky, where other people might be familiar with the Northeast Station. And it's part of the Yenisei River Basin where we're working in the Central Siberian Plateau. It's in a town called Tura, in the green star in the center of the plateau. And so these watersheds have been experiencing fires for over 100 years. So we have a chronosequence of 100 years where streams have burned between 3 years ago to over 100. Now we don't have water samples from over 100 years ago, but we can use this large chronosequence in a space for time approach where we can use the 100-year burn sites, or the oldest burn sites, as a representation of what this area looked like before any fires. And then we have fires recently burned watersheds and times in between to complete an over 100-year series. So we were able to sample all of these different streams and be able to see how fires influencing the chemistry. And so what we found was that here in these figures, the x-axis is the times since fire, and the streams have been grouped into groups by the time since fire, going from 10 in the red being the recently burned watersheds, and 100, the green, being the older burned watersheds. And so what we found was that DOC and DON concentrations in panel A and B show a similar pattern, where the recently burned watersheds in red show lower DOC concentrations, and as time since the last fire starts to increase, then these DOC concentrations start to go up, where they plateau after 50 years, and there's no statistically significant change between those groups, suggesting that it takes about 50 years for the forest to come back, for the forest, the soil, and the moss to all be able to come back and create conditions in the stream that are similar to what the forest looked like 100 years ago. But the story is slightly different with inorganic nitrogen. And here I'm showing dissolved inorganic nitrogen, which is the sum of nitrate and ammonium. And in these streams, nitrate is a major part of the DIN pool, and ammonium is a smaller portion of the DIN pool. So these streams are mostly dominated by nitrate concentrations, but we've pulled them together as DIN. And you can see that in the recently burned watersheds in the red box plot, DIN concentrations are higher than all the other years. And after 10 years, then these DIN concentrations come back down to what they looked like before fire, as there was no difference between the mid-burned and the older burned sites. So for DIN concentrations, it takes about 10 to 25 years to come back to pre-fire conditions, and that's almost half the time as DOC concentrations or DON concentrations. And so looking at this DOC to DIN ratio, which is, you can think of it as a ratio of energy to nutrient, DOC being the energy and DIN being the nutrient. There's this imbalance in the earlier burned watersheds where there's a lot more nutrient than energy, so lower DOC to DIN ratios, where there's more DON than DOC. And after 25 years, this DOC to DIN ratio flips, and there's a lot more DOC than DON, so a lot more energy than nutrient in these streams. And this change after 25 years is similar, suggesting that DIN might be the limiting step or the driver of maintaining the stoichiometric balance of these streams. So DIN might sort of be a limiting step to the biogeochemical processes of these streams. And recognizing that DOC and DON concentrations are changing, we looked a little more into the DOM composition of these streams. So here I'm showing a few of the different parameters that we analyzed. First is the slope ratio, as denoted by S sub R. And slope ratio is negatively related to the molecular weight of the organic matter. So the higher the SR ratio or the slope ratio, the lower the molecular weight. And we can see that in panel A, there's this declining trend in slope ratios over time, where the recently burned watersheds show higher slope ratios or lower molecular weight, and then they start changing to higher molecular weight as time goes by. And this is suggestive of the forest coming back to the forest regrowing and being reflected in the water chemistry, whereas the forest starts to increase and that the composition of that organic matter starts to get more complicated and more lignin and aromatic-like. And this sort of regeneration of the forest is somewhat reflected as well in these other compound groups that are determined by FTI-CRMS. So in panel B, the aliphatics are the really simple structured DOM, and these are low in recently burned sites and start to increase. And there's a much larger variability in aliphatics in the older burned watersheds in the green bar, suggesting once again that these forests provide a lot more simple organic matter when they're the forest, the soil structures are deeper and back to what they were 100 years ago. And similarly, the polyphenolics, which are the really aromatic and lignin-like organic matter, there was no statistically significant pattern, but there's sort of an increase over time and then a decline, where the lowest were in the recently burned watersheds and start to increase. And this can reflect once the forest reach some a certain maturity where they no longer export nutrients or organic matter. And lastly, the condensed aromatics in panel D are what's referred to as black carbon, so it's representative of the charred material. And here there was once again no pattern, but it's interesting that these watersheds that have burned for such a long period of time that we can easily identify a black carbon signal or a condensed aromatic signal. But that's not new just to our study. There are other studies that have also found that identifying the black carbon after a series of burns is a little difficult. And it's probably because this is molecules that are really hard to biodegrade, so they might take some time before they're actively being processed in the system. And so we found that the fires are changing the stream chemistry and the DOM composition. So we wanted to find out how do these nutrients that are coming into the streams are being processed. So in some of the streams in this 100-year chronosequence, we performed a series of nutrient pulse additions. And what this consists of is a whole string manipulation of a biological tracer. So what we do is we add a biological tracer, which in this case is nitrate and ammonium, along with a conservative tracer such as chloride. And these are added at the head of the experimental reach, as you can see in this orange arrow. And the solution is added at the top, and it travels downstream to the base or a fixed point where we collect samples as that solution moves through. And that creates what's called a breakthrough curve, and it's a change in concentration over time, where in the figure, those different dots in the curve, I don't know if you can see my cursor, these different dots represent different samples that are collected along this breakthrough curve to really characterize that change over time. And we can integrate this curve and calculate a series of uptake metrics. And so I will be focusing on uptake velocity because it's the best metric to compare across sites and across experiments. It's normalized for width and depth and discharge of the river, so it's a really nice metric to be able to compare different dates and different sites. And here on the y-axis, we've clumped together nitrate and ammonium uptake rates as DIN, uptake velocity. Here, the circles are ammonium uptake and the triangles are nitrate uptake. And the different colors correspond to the streams binned in the different years since the last fire classification. Once again, red being the recently burned watersheds and green being the older, the control or older burned watersheds. And we can see that in panel A, as DIN concentrations increase, then uptake, or this demand, this efficiency at which the microbial community can take up inorganic nitrogen, starts to decline. And this demonstrates that the recently burned watersheds are becoming saturated in nitrogen. And so the microbial community cannot take up more nitrogen, and this excess nitrogen that's reaching the streams is going to be exported downstream into receiving bodies of water. And when we compare this uptake velocity with DOC to DIN ratios, so once again, it's this energy to nutrient balance, we found that in lower DOC to DIN ratios, there was very little uptake. And as the stoichiometric ratio starts to increase, then uptake also starts to increase. We're at the higher end of DOC to DIN ratios, so greater energy to nutrient ratio. There's a greater uptake of nitrate, potentially being subsidized by this energetic content of the organic matter in the stream. That it's much higher in the older burn sites. And we found this interesting relationship between uptake and polyphenolics. And polyphenolics is thought to be this very aromatic molecule. But here we're finding that greater polyphenolics can potentially lead to greater nitrate uptake. So polyphenolics might not be as aromatic as we think they are. And other studies have found that they can be an important energy source in potentially energy limited systems, despite being high carbon systems like we have in these streams. And so here it's not just carbon or nitrogen controlling nitrate uptake, but it's the balance between this energy and nutrient relationship. It's the stoichiometric relationships that need to be at a certain level in order to support the biogeochemical or heterotrophic processes that are happening in these streams. And now identifying that these streams can become exporters of nitrogen, we wanted to sort of get an idea of how these rivers are processing these nutrients that are coming in from the streams that cannot take up this nitrate. So we performed some 24-hour river incubations using water from the Ninseya Tunguska River and the Cochicham River, which are the two main tributaries where these smaller watersheds drain into. And we did 24-hour amendments where we added nitrate, ammonium, and acetate to triplicate jars along with a control jar where we didn't add anything to it. And we took samples at various time steps within this 24 hours to be able to get a change in concentration over time for both rivers for these three different solids. And here is a pretty coarse attempt at trying to get an uptake metric. And what we found was that here the x-axis are the different amendments, and the y-axis is this uptake rate as a change over time, changing concentration over time. The blue bars are data from the Cochicham River, and the orange bars are the Tunguska River. And we found that acetate uptake is pretty similar in both streams. So a positive value means uptake, and a negative value means some sort of release or production of these solutes. So for both rivers, there's an uptake or a demand of carbon, but the responses in inorganic nitrogen are pretty opposite. So when in the ammonium amendments, the Cochicham River seemed to produce ammonium, while in the Tunguska there was a demand for ammonium, and then the opposite happened for nitrate, where the Cochicham there was a demand of nitrate, but then a production of nitrate. So it's somewhat inconsistent in the behavior of these streams and how they respond to pulses of nutrients, which can be a major issue if the sub-watersheds of the Cochicham River and the Tunguska River start to burn more often, and how they'll process nutrients and later export them to the bigger rivers, which they flow into the Yenisei River much further downstream than where we are. And in these 24-hour incubations, we also collected samples for DOM composition. And here, these are a few of the DOM optical properties. The bright orange, so the figure on the right are data from the Tunguska River, and on the left are the Tunguska River, and on the right is the Cochicham River. And the bright orange bar are samples collected directly from the river prior to the incubations. And the same for the Cochicham River. The dark blue bar is data from the river collected prior to the incubations. And for both figures, the light blue are the controlled incubations, the gray are ammonium amendments, the green are the nitrate amendments, and the pink are the acetate amendments. And these are the samples after 24 hours from the incubation. And we analyze them for SUVA, which is an index of aromaticity, a slope ratio, which I mentioned before is a surrogate for molecular weight, and the humidification index, or HIX as in here. It's a signal of a DOM degradation. And for both rivers, despite the different amendments, especially in the Tunguska, the DOM optical properties did not change whatsoever. So the DOM in the Tunguska River, the SUVA is almost 3, so it's somewhat aromatic. So the DOM in the Tunguska River is aromatic and doesn't really biodegrade even with added amendments, added nutrients. And in the Cochicham, the slope ratios and humidification index are pretty similar despite the different amendments. But SUVA seems to increase with the nitrate and acetate amendments. So this could be that the Cochicham has a greater ability to process nitrate, and so it has this microbial loop of excreting more organic material as it takes up this nitrate. And in the previous slide, we saw that there's greater uptake of nitrate in the Cochicham River. But these are still pretty coarse, and as you can see, there's no error bars or no statistics in them, so they're pretty preliminary data. And to summarize this first part, we found that fires alter stream chemistry and DOM composition. There's a decline in DIN uptake in the streams that are affected by fire, but we see variable responses in DIN in the bigger rivers, such as the Tunguska and the Cochicham. And the DOM in these bigger rivers is probably refractory to support a lot of the biological or biogeochemical processes that are happening. And so now we'll change the focus to a different Arctic system. So now we'll be talking about tundra systems in the Yukon-Kuskokwim River Delta. And the YK Delta for short is located in the southwest part of Alaska, as described in this red dot. And the data I'll be showing you today was collected as part of the Polaris project. For those that are not familiar with the Polaris project, it's a summer research program for undergraduate students that they can develop their own research projects within the context of some Arctic issue. And since 2017, the Polaris project has been going to the YK Delta to do its field work. And students we camp in the tundra for about 2 weeks, and we eat some delicious food despite it coming out of cans and boxes. And the students have the ability to do whatever sort of project they want. We had students that focused on zooplankton and macroinvertebrates in lakes, to students doing fruit and vegetation surveys, as well as greenhouse gas fluxes. So it's really up to the student, and they develop their project from beginning to end. And one of the major issues why the Polaris project is now going on in Southwest Alaska in the Yukon-Kuskokwim River Delta is because this region has been experiencing a lot more fires than usual. When you fly over the area, you can see the charred patches of tundra. So in these images, the aerial picture, you can see the peak plateaus that are burned, but then these valleys are really green and really lush because, well, they're a lot more wet. And you can see on the landscape, you can easily find in the landscape the areas that have burned and have not burned. And when you walk around in the landscape, you know when you're in a burned area because the ground is a lot harder and a lot easier to walk around than the fluffy moss and the non-burned areas. So taking advantage of these areas that are really easily to identify as burned and not burned, we once again wanted to ask this question of how do fires influence stream chemistry, but now in a tundra landscape. But first, I'll show you some data from some lentic systems, so fens, lakes, and ponds. And these data were collected from the students from 2017, 2018, and 2019. And so it's a wide variety of different systems that are classified into fen, lakes, and ponds. And you can see that for these different parameters, DOC concentrations, DON, nitrate, and ammonium, there's no clear pattern between fens, lakes, and ponds, or so the effects of fire on these different aquatic ecosystems. Now, this could be a statistical issue or just the way that these different sites are being classified. But when we look at the streams, so these is a much smaller number of observations. In the streams, there's a much clearer effect of fire on the stream chemistry. So all these different solutes, DOC concentrations, DON, nitrate, and ammonium, are all much higher in the burned streams than in the unburned streams. And these differences between the streams and the lentic systems could be, like I said, a statistical issue where here there's a much smaller number of streams. Here there's about 5 streams that are going into this data, whereas the other lakes, there's a much larger number of data sets or number of lakes observed. Or it could be the connection with the terrestrial landscape. Lakes and ponds have much higher residence times, and so it takes a lot more time for these lakes to become more homogeneous from what's coming in from the terrestrial side, whereas streams are continuously moving and moving material from the landscape into the water as they continuously flow through and flow downstream. So it could be an either or, I'm not sure, but I'm happy to talk more about this later on, as it's a very intriguing dilemma, so to speak. And so in these streams that have burned and not burned, we also perform these nutrient pulse additions, but a much smaller number of observations. And here we did nitrate and ammonium additions, again, using the same exact method to calculate these uptake rates. And so what we found when grouping, again, the nitrate and the ammonium uptake and this inorganic nitrogen uptake velocity, or VF, we found that the burned streams have much lower uptake velocities than the unburned streams. So once again, burned streams not being able to take up these increase in nutrients as the unburned streams. And these burned streams becoming major, or not major, but they can become a major and important source of nitrogen within these watersheds of these Arctic locations. And I've talked a lot about these different uptake velocities in the Central Siberian Plateau and here and in Alaska. And I wanted to put them in some sort of context so you have a better idea of what this means. And so here I'm showing data from, these are just nitrate uptake velocity, so no longer ammonium or DIN, it's just nitrate. And they're regressed against C to N ratio, DOC to nitrate ratios. And here, the data from the YK Delta are in blue as Alaska, and the Central Siberian Plateau are in gray as Siberia. And they're plotted along with data from Guadalupe and Luquillo, which are tropical places, and New Hampshire, which is a temperate forest. And in this very wide range of biomes, we see that Alaska and Siberia fall within these different points. So the uptake, for the uptake metrics of these Arctic systems are similar to their counterparts in the tropics and in temperate systems. And this is interesting because Arctic systems have a much drastic seasonal changes in hydrologic characteristics than do the tropical and the temperate forests. But what's happening in the stream seems to be similar across these different systems. And again, looking at this energy to nutrient ratio across these different biomes with a wide range of concentrations in both DOC, nitrate, or DIN, whichever way you want to think of it, the higher the DOC to nitrate ratio. So the greater the energy to nutrient ratio, the greater the nitrate uptake, or the greater the ability for the heterotrophic community to be able to take up nutrients. And it's interesting that it holds across these different biomes. And to summarize, these effects of fire here I'm comparing, very generally comparing boreal versus tundra systems, because I want to drive home this idea that the effects of fire in the Arctic are not the same. The Central Siberian Plateau is one example of boreal systems, and the YK Delta is one example of the tundra system. There's a wider range of biomes and ecotypes within the Pan-Arctic, but here's just a quick comparison, or a small comparison, of the effects of fire, and that they're not consistent. And it's important to have these in mind when developing these Pan-Arctic models when it comes to carbon budgets or greenhouse gas fluxes or nutrient budgets, that the effects of fire or disturbances in the Arctic is not a one-fits-all sort of situation. And so in comparing just these two sites, there's a difference response in DOC and DON, where in tundra systems, the organic matter is going up after fires, but in the boreal forest, it's going down. Nitrate seems to respond the same in both systems, and ammonium is pretty similar. Although in the data that I presented here, I clumped nitrate and ammonium together, but when ammonium is looked alone for the Central Siberian Plateau, there's no clear change or no clear signal of increasing or decreasing. So there are some differences in how the system responds, and it's important to keep those in mind in developing these Pan-Arctic models and summaries of landscape disturbances. And so to quickly summarize this, the portion of the YK Delta, so fires affect the effects of fire in lentic systems versus low-tick systems is pretty different. And fires, once again, alter the stream chemistry and again decline the ability for these streams to take up, or not the streams, the microbial community in the streams to take up this inorganic nitrogen, and once again highlight the inconsistencies in the effects of fire between boreal versus tundra systems. Now for the last part of my talk, really quickly, we're going to go back to boreal systems, but now we're going to go to northern Quebec and focus and share a little bit with you on what I'm working on now. What I've showed you before is what I worked on my PhD, so I wanted to just give a quick summary or a quick insight into what it is that I'm working on now. And so here in the CAWS group at UQAM, we're working on knowing what the influence of these hydroelectric dams that we have here in Quebec and how they influence the biogeochemistry of the rivers. And so we're working in the La Romane hydroelectric complex in northeast Quebec. And so it's one of the hydroelectric dams that feeds the electricity that Hydro-Quebec provides. And so the La Romane River has been partitioned into 4 different reservoirs. So La Romane 1 was built in 2016, La Romane 2 in 2014, La Romane 3 in 2017. And this summer, La Romane 4 was finished. It was finished built and it was flooded halfway. So next summer, hoping that COVID allows us, we'll be able to add a time series with this new reservoir of La Romane 4. And so the CAWS group has been able to go and sample these different reservoirs for multiple years. So there's a really nice time series of what the river looks like before and after the building of these reservoirs. And just a quick view into one of the parameters. So I've spent a lot of time talking about carbon and nitrogen. So now we're going to briefly look at phosphorus in the river. And so the way that this figure is oriented, and the x-axis is the distance from the mouth, where 0 is the estuary at the St. Lawrence Gulf, and 300 and above is the upriver of the reservoirs. And the boxes are the different reservoirs as the water moves downstream. So reservoir RO3, reservoir 3, RO2, reservoir 2, and RO1, reservoir 1. The different colors are the different sampling years, and the shapes are the system when it was a river, or a reservoir. And the shapes really come into play when you look at the data within the reservoir. So for example, in reservoir 3, hopefully you can see my cursor. So when you look at reservoir 3 on the bottom here below at about 5 micrograms per liter is the river before it was a reservoir. And then when the reservoir 3, after the river became reservoir 3, then phosphorus concentrations are above 10 micrograms per liter. So within one of these snapshots, or not snapshots, one of these slivers of the river of the reservoir, you can see how it's changed after the reservoir was built. And as the river moves downstream, so when upriver, concentrations are relatively low, and you can see that they start to increase as the water moves from the river into reservoir 3, into reservoir 2, into reservoir 1, and then out into the estuary. And these changes are significant as the water is moving downstream. And so one of the hypotheses for the increase in phosphorus concentrations is that it's correlated to the photodegradability of the dissolved organic matter. So here in this figure, you can see on the x-axis the percent of the photodegradation of the DOM, and the higher the photodegradation, there's greater phosphorus concentrations. So potentially the photodegradation of the dissolved organic matter in these reservoirs is releasing some of the phosphorus that's held into these highly aromatic molecules. But this is just a snapshot of what I'm working on now. I'll make a very, very, very shameless plug in that I'll be sharing the full story of La Roman River at AGU. My talk is on Friday, December 11th at 4 p.m. Pacific time in the lakes and inland water bodies. So if this is of interest to you in any way, then I invite you to come enjoy and join the session at AGU on this Friday. And so with that, I'd like to first of all, thank everyone for joining and listening in. Earlier, I was looking through the participant list and I saw lots of friendly names, so thank you for joining in. And to those that I don't know, welcome, and thank you for coming in to listen to my talk. And I'll leave my contact information up in case anyone wants to get in touch with me afterwards, or drop a line. I'd be happy to continue talking about these different topics. And a shout out to the long list of collaborators and funding sources that have helped to curate these different data sets and projects.